sing of a British king of many long years ago, how he ruled the land with an iron hand, but his mind was weak and low. He loved to chase the royal stag all over the good green wood, but his favorite occupation, the idle-dee-dee-dee. He was wild and woolly, covered with fleas, the idle-doodly-doodly-knees. Oh, God save the bastardly king of England, now the Queen.
Hello everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev and we're reading chapter 5 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and this is Hermione. Before we dig right into it, remember hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoy the episode. By 1787, there was not only a positive need for strong central government to protect the large economic interests, but also immediate fear of rebellion by discontented farmers. The chief event causing this fear was an uprising in the summer of 1786 in western Massachusetts known as Shays' Rebellion. In the western towns of Massachusetts, there was resentment against the legislature in Boston. The new Constitution of 1780 had raised the property qualifications for voting. No one could hold state office without being quite wealthy. Furthermore, the legislature was refusing to issue paper money, as had been done in some other states, like Rhode Island, to make it easier for debt-ridden farmers to pay off their creditors. Illegal conventions began to assemble in some of the western counties to organize opposition to the legislature. At one of these, a man named Plowed Jogger spoke his mind. I have been greatly abused, have been obliged to do more than my part in the war, been loaded with class rates, town rates, province rates, continental rates, and all rates. Been pulled and hauled by sheriffs, constables, and collectors, and had my cattle sold for less than they were worth. The great men are going to get all we have, and I think it is time for us to rise and put a stop to it and have no more courts, nor sheriffs, nor collectors, nor lawyers. The chairman of that meeting used his gavel to cut short the applause. He and others wanted to redress their grievances, but peacefully by petition to the General Court, the legislature, in Boston. However, before the scheduled meeting of the General Court, there were going to be court proceedings in Hampshire County in the towns of Northampton and Springfield to seize the cattle of farmers who hadn't paid their debts, to take away their land, now full of grain and ready for harvest. And so, veterans of the Continental Army, also aggrieved because they had been treated poorly on discharge, given certificates for future redemption instead of immediate cash, began to organize the farmers into squads and companies. One of these veterans was Luke Day, who arrived the morning of court with the fife and drum corps, still angry with the memory of being locked up in debtor's prison in the heat of the previous summer. The sheriff looked to the local militia to defend the court against these armed farmers, but most of the militia was with Luke Day. The sheriff did manage to gather 500 men, and the judges put on their black silk robes, waiting for the sheriff to protect their trip to the courthouse. But there at the courthouse steps, Luke Day stood with a petition asserting the people's constitutional right to protest the unconstitutional acts of the General Court, asking the judges to adjourn until the General Court could act on behalf of the farmers. Standing with Luke Day were 1,500 armed farmers. The judges adjourned. Shortly after, at courthouses in Worcester and Athol, farmers with guns prevented the courts from meeting to take away their property, and the militia were too sympathetic to the farmers or too outnumbered to act. In Concord, a 50-year-old veteran of 2 wars, Job Shattuck, led a caravan of carts, wagons, horses, and oxen onto the town green while a message was sent to the judges. The voice of the people of this county is such that the court shall not enter this courthouse until such time as the people shall have redress of the grievances they labor under at the present. A county convention then suggested the judges adjourn, which they did. At Great Barrington, a militia of 1,000 faced a square crowded with armed men and boys, but the militia was split in its opinion. When the Chief Justice suggested the militia divide, those in favor of the court sitting to go on the right side of the road and those on the left, 200 of the militia went to the right, 800 to the left, and the judges adjourned. Then the crowd went to the home of the Chief Justice, who agreed to sign a pledge that the court would not sit until the Massachusetts General Court met. The crowd went back to the square, broke open the county jail, and set free the debtors. The Chief Justice, a country doctor, said, "I have never heard anybody point out a better way to have their grievances redressed than the people have taken." The governor and the political leaders of Massachusetts became alarmed. Samuel Adams, once looked on as a radical leader in Boston, now insisted people act within the law. He said British emissaries were stirring up the farmers. Russian spies. People in the town of Greenwich responded, "You in Boston have the money, and we don't. And didn't you act illegally yourselves in the Revolution?" The insurgents were now being called regulators. Their emblem was a sprig of hemlock. The problem went beyond Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, the debtors had taken over the legislature and were issuing paper money. In New Hampshire, several hundred men in September of 1786 surrounded the legislature in Exeter, asking that taxes be returned and paper money issued. They dispersed only when military action was threatened. Daniel Shays entered the scene in western Massachusetts. A poor farmhand when the Revolution broke out, he joined the Continental Army, fought at Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Saratoga, and was wounded in action. In 1780, not being paid, he resigned from the army, went home, and soon found himself in court for non-payment of debts. He also saw what was happening to others. A sick woman, unable to pay, had her bed taken from under her. You can't make this stuff up. What brought Shays fully into the situation was that on September 19th, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts met in Worcester and indicted 11 leaders of the rebellion, including 3 of his friends, as disorderly, riotous, and seditious persons who unlawfully and by force of arms prevented the execution of justice and the laws of the Commonwealth. The Supreme Judicial Court planned to meet again in Springfield a week later, and there was talk of Luke Days being indicted. Shays organized 700 armed farmers, most of them veterans of the war, and led them to Springfield. There they found a general with 900 soldiers and a cannon. Shays asked the general for permission to parade, which the general granted. So Shays and his men moved through the square, drums banging and fifes blowing. As they marched, their ranks grew. some of the militia joined and reinforcements began coming in from the countryside. The judges postponed hearings for a day, you think, then adjourned the court. Excuse me. Now, the General Court meeting in Boston was told by Governor James Bowdoin to vindicate the insulted dignity of government. The recent rebels against England, secure in office, were calling for law and order. Samuel Adams helped draw up a riot act and a resolution suspending habeas corpus to allow the authorities to keep people in jail without trial. Nice, Sam Adams. At the same time, the legislature moved to make some concessions to the angry farmers, saying certain old taxes could now be paid in goods instead of money. This didn't help. In Worcester, 160 insurgents appeared at the courthouse. The sheriff read the riot act. I wonder if that's where the phrase "read them the riot act" comes from. I'll bet it is. The sheriff read the riot act. The insurgents said they would disperse only if the judges did. The sheriff shouted something about hanging. Someone came up behind him and put a sprig of hemlock in his hat. The judges laughed. Confrontations between farmers and militia now multiplied. The winter snows began to interfere with the trips of farmers to the courthouses. When Shays began marching 1,000 men into Boston, a blizzard forced them back and one of his men froze to death. An army came into the field, led by General Benjamin Lincoln, on money raised by Boston merchants. In an artillery duel, 3 rebels were killed. One soldier stepped in front of his own artillery piece and lost both arms. Why? Why would you step in front of your own artillery piece? The winter grew worse. The rebels were outnumbered and on the run. Shays took refuge in Vermont, and his followers began to surrender. There were a few more deaths in battle, and then sporadic, disorganized, desperate acts of violence against authority. The burning of barns, the slaughter of a general's horse. One government soldier was killed in an eerie nighttime collision of 2 sleighs. Captured rebels were put on trial in Northampton, and 6 were sentenced to death. A note was left at the door of the High Sheriff of Pittsfield. I understand that there is a number of my countrymen condemned to die because they fought for justice. I pray have a care that you assist not in the execution of so horrid a crime, for by all that is above, he that condemns and he that executes shall share alike. Prepare for death with speed, for your life or mine is short. When the woods are covered with leaves, I shall return and pay you a short visit. 33 more rebels were put on trial and 6 more condemned to death. Arguments took place over whether the hangings should go forward. Oh, goodness. General Lincoln urged mercy and a commission of clemency, but Samuel Adams said, "In monarchy, the crime of treason may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death." Several hangings followed. Some of the condemned were pardoned. Shays in Vermont was pardoned in 1788 and returned to Massachusetts, where he died, poor and obscure, in 1825. It was Thomas Jefferson, in France as ambassador at the time of Shays' rebellion, who spoke of such uprisings as healthy for society. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, Thomas Jefferson, "I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government. God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is the natural manure. But Jefferson was far from the scene. The political and economic elite of the country were not so tolerant. They worried that the example might spread. A veteran of Washington's army, General Henry Knox, founded an organization of army veterans, the Order of the Cincinnati, presumably, as one historian put it, for the purpose of cherishing the heroic memories of the struggle in which they had taken part, but also, it seemed, to watch out for radicalism in the new country. Knox wrote to Washington in late 1786 about Shays' Rebellion, and in doing so expressed the thoughts of many of the wealthy and powerful leaders of the country. The people who are the insurgents have never paid any or but very little taxes, but they see the weakness of government. They feel at once their own poverty compared with the opulent and their own force, and they are determined to make use of the latter in order to remedy the former. Their creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from the confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. And he that attempts opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice and ought to be swept from off the face of the earth. Alexander Hamilton, aide to Washington during the war, was one of the most forceful and astute leaders of the new aristocracy. He voiced his political philosophy. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the other the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God, and however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give therefore to the first class a distinct permanent share in the government. Can a democratic assembly who annually revolve in the mass of the people be supposed steadily to pursue the public good? Nothing but a permanent body can check the imprudence of democracy. That is a lot different than the Hamilton that's portrayed in the musical, isn't it? At the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton suggested a president and Senate chosen for life. Wow. The convention did not take his suggestion, but neither did it provide for popular elections, except in the case of the House of Representatives, where the qualifications were set by the state legislatures, which required property holding for voting in almost all the states and excluded women, Indians, slaves. The Constitution provided for senators to be elected by the state legislators, for the president to be elected by electors chosen by the state legislators, and for the Supreme Court to be appointed by the president. The problem of democracy in the post-revolutionary society was not, however, the constitutional limitations on voting. It lay deeper, beyond the Constitution, in the division of society into rich and poor. For if some people had great wealth and great influence, if they had the lands, the money, the newspapers, the church, the educational system, how could voting, however broad, cut into such power? There was still another problem. Wasn't it the nature of representative government, even when most broadly based, to be conservative, to prevent tumultuous change? It came time to ratify the Constitution, to submit to a vote in state conventions with approval of 9 of the 13 required to ratify it. In New York, where debate over ratification was intense, a series of newspaper articles appeared anonymously, and they tell us much about the nature of the Constitution. These articles favoring adoption of the Constitution were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, and came to be known as the Federalist Papers. Opponents of the Constitution became known as Anti-Federalists. In Federalist Paper number 10, James Madison argued that the representative government was needed to maintain peace in a society ridden by factional disputes. These disputes came from the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. The problem, he said, was how to control the factional struggles that came from inequalities in wealth. Minority factions could be controlled, he said, by the principle that decisions would be by vote of the majority. So the real problem, according to Madison, was a majority faction. And here the solution was offered by the Constitution to have an extensive republic. That is, a large nation ranging over 13 states. For then it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. Madison's argument can be seen as a sensible argument for having a government which can maintain peace and avoid continuous disorder. But is it the aim of government simply to maintain order as a referee between two equally matched fighters? Or is it that government has some special interest in maintaining a certain kind of order, a certain distribution of power and wealth? A distribution in which government officials are not neutral referees, but participants. In that case, the disorder they might worry about is the disorder of popular rebellion against those monopolizing the society's wealth. This interpretation makes sense when one looks at the economic interests, the social backgrounds of the makers of the Constitution. As part of this argument for a large republic to keep the peace, James Madison tells quite clearly in Federalist number 10 whose peace he wants to keep. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. When economic interest is seen behind the political clauses of the Constitution, then the document becomes not simply the work of wise men trying to establish a decent and orderly society, but the work of certain groups trying to maintain their privileges while giving just enough rights and liberties to just enough of the people to ensure popular support. In the new government, Madison would belong to one party, the Democratic Republicans, along with Jefferson and Monroe. Hamilton would belong to the rival party, the Federalists, along with Washington and Adams. But both agreed, one a slaveholder from Virginia, the other a merchant from New York, on the aims of this new government they were establishing. They were anticipating the long fundamental agreement of the two political parties in the American system. Hamilton wrote elsewhere in the Federalist Papers that the new Union would be able to repress domestic faction and insurrection. He referred directly to Shays' Rebellion, the tempestuous situation from which Massachusetts has scarcely emerged evinces that dangers of this kind are not merely speculative. It was either Madison or Hamilton, the authorship of the individual papers is not always known, who in Federalist Paper number 63 argued the necessity of a well-constructed Senate as sometimes necessary as a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. Because there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or some illicit advantage or misled by the artful misrepresentation of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be the most ready to lament and condemn. And in these critical moments, how salutary will be the inference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to check the misguided career and to suspend the blow meditated by the people against themselves, until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. 'Cause we're stupid. The Constitution was a compromise between slave-holding interests of the South and moneyed interests of the North, for the purpose of uniting the 13 states into one great market for commerce. The Northern delegates wanted laws regulating interstate commerce and urged that such laws require only a majority of Congress to pass. The South agreed to this in return for allowing the trade in slaves to continue for 20 years before being outlawed. Charles Beard warned us that governments, including the government of the United States, are not neutral, that they represent the dominant economic interests, and that their constitutions are intended to serve these interests. One of his critics, Robert E. Brown, raises an interesting point. Granted that the Constitution omitted the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which appeared in the Declaration of Independence, and substituted life, liberty, or property. Well, why shouldn't the Constitution protect property? As Brown says about revolutionary America, practically everybody was interested in the protection of property because so many Americans owned property. However, this is misleading. True, there were many property owners, but some people had much more than others. A few people had great amounts of property, many people had small amounts. Others had none. Jackson, Maine found that 1/3 of the population in the Revolutionary period were small farmers, while only 3% of the population had truly large holdings and could be considered wealthy. Still, 1/3 was a considerable number of people who felt they had something at stake in the stability of a new government. This was a larger base of support for government than anywhere in the world at the end of the 18th century. In addition, the city mechanics had an important interest in a government which would protect their work from foreign competition. As Stoughton Lynd puts it, how is it that the city working men all over America overwhelmingly and enthusiastically supported the United States Constitution? This was especially true in New York. When the 9th and 10th states had ratified the Constitution, 4,000 New York City mechanics marched with floats and banners to celebrate. Bakers, blacksmiths, brewers, ship joiners and shipwrights, coopers, cartmen, and tailors all marched. What Lynd found was that these mechanics, while opposing elite rule in the colonies, were nationalists. Mechanics comprised perhaps half the New York population. Some were wealthy, some were poor, but all were better off than the ordinary laborer. The apprentice, the journeyman, and their prosperity required a government that would protect them against the British hats and shoes and other goods that were pouring into the colonies after the Revolution. As a result, the mechanics often supported wealthy conservatives at the ballot box. The Constitution then illustrates the complexity of the American system, that it serves the interest of a wealthy elite, but also does enough for small property owners, for middle-income mechanics and farmers to build a broad base of support. The slightly prosperous people who make up this base of support are buffers against the blacks, the Indians, the very poor whites. They enable the elite to keep control with a minimum of coercion, a maximum of law, all made palatable by the fanfare of patriotism and unity. The gatekeepers he talks about in chapter 23. The Constitution became even more acceptable to the public at large after the first Congress, responding to criticism, passed a series of amendments known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments seemed to make the new government a guardian of people's liberties, to speak, to publish, to worship, to petition, to assemble, to be tried fairly, to be secured at home against official intrusion. It was therefore perfectly designed to build popular backing for the new government. What was not made clear, it was a time when the language of freedom was new and its reality untested, was the shakiness of anyone's liberty who entrusted to a government of the rich and powerful. Indeed, the same problem existed for the other provisions of the Constitution, like the clause forbidding states to impair the obligation of contract, or that giving Congress the power to tax the people and to appropriate money. They all sound benign and neutral until one day, tax who? For what? Appropriate what? For whom? To protect everyone's contracts? Seems like an act of fairness, of equal treatment, until one considers the contracts made between rich and poor, between employer and employee, landlord and tenant, creditor and debtor, generally favor the more powerful of the two parties. Thus, to protect these contracts is to put the great power of the government, its laws, courts, sheriffs, police, on the side of the privileged, and to do it not as in pre-modern times, as an exercise of brute force against the weak, but as a matter of law. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights shows that quality of interest hiding behind innocence. Passed in 1791 by Congress, it provided that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Yet 7 years after the First Amendment became part of the Constitution, Congress passed a law very clearly abridging the freedom of speech. This was the Sedition Act of 1798, passed under John Adams' administration at a time when Irishmen and Frenchmen in the United States were looked on as dangerous revolutionaries because of the recent French Revolution and the Irish rebellions. The Sedition Act made it a crime to say or write anything false, scandalous, and malicious against the government. Congress or the President, with intent to defame them, that's the same sentence, against the government, Congress, or the President, with intent to defame them, bring them into disrepute, or excite popular hatreds against them. And then, who's to say what's false? This act seemed to directly violate the First Amendment, yet it was enforced. 10 Americans were put in prison for utterances against the government, and every member of the Supreme Court in 1798 to 1800, sitting as an appellate judge, held it constitutional. There was a legal basis for this, one known to legal experts, but not to the ordinary American, who would read the First Amendment and feel confident that he or she was protected in the exercise of free speech. That basis had been explained by historian Leonard Levy. Levy points out that it was generally understood, not in the population but in higher circles, that despite the First Amendment, the British common law of seditious libel still ruled in America. This meant that while the government could not exercise prior restraint, that is, prevent an utterance or publication in advance, it could legally punish the speaker or writer afterward. Thus, Congress has a convenient legal basis for the laws it has enacted since that time, making certain kinds of speech a crime. And since punishment after the fact is an excellent deterrent to the exercise of free expression, the claim of no prior restraint itself is destroyed. This leaves the First Amendment much less than the stone wall of protection it seems at first glance. I apologize, we're running a little late, but I'm really trying to finish this chapter. I got just over a page. Bear with me, please. Are the economic provisions in the Constitution enforced just as weakly? We have an instructive example almost immediately in Washington's first administration, when Congress's power to tax and appropriate money was immediately put to use by the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, believing the government must ally itself with the richest elements of society to make itself strong, proposed to Congress a series of laws which it enacted expressing this philosophy. A Bank of the United States was set up as a partnership between the government and certain banking interests. A tariff was passed to help the manufacturers. It was agreed to pay bondholders. Most of the war bonds were now concentrated in a small group of wealthy people, the full value of their bonds. Tax laws were passed to raise money for this bond redemption. One of these tax laws was the whiskey tax, which especially hurt small farmers who raised grain that they converted into whiskey and then sold. In 1794, the farmers of western Pennsylvania took up arms and rebelled against the collection of this tax. Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, led the troops that put them down. We see then in the first years of the Constitution that some of its provisions, even those paraded most flamboyantly like the First Amendment, might be treated lightly. Others, like the power to tax, would be powerfully enforced. Still, the mythology around the Founding Fathers persists. To say, as one historian has done recently, named Bernard Bailyn, that the destruction of privilege and the creation of a political system that demanded of its leaders the responsible and humane use of power were their highest aspirations is to ignore what really happened in the America of these Founding Fathers. Bailyn says, everyone knew the basic prescription for a wise and just government. It was so to balance the contending powers in society that no one power could overwhelm the others, and unchecked destroy the liberties that belonged to all. The problem was how to arrange the institutions of government so that this balance could be achieved. Were the Founding Fathers wise and just men trying to achieve a good balance? In fact, they did not want a balance except one which kept things as they were, a balance among the dominant forces at that time. They certainly did not want an equal balance between slaves and masters, propertyless and property holders, Indians and white. As many as half the people were not even considered by the Founding Fathers as among Bailyn's contending powers in society. They were not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. They were absent in the Constitution. They were invisible in the new political democracy. They were the women of early America. Thanks for joining me. I do hope you enjoyed it. Hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.